In today's podcast, I'd like for us to look at the book of Ezra. And I don't much care for Ezra. I think Ezra is a good referent person for what was wrong with the Jewish faith at the time Jesus came. Now, in timeline, the book of Ezra was written about the year 430 BCE, which was about 30 to 35 years after the book of Esther. So when we're looking at the sequence, some things had happened. We see that Ezra reports on how people came back to Jerusalem. They saw where the temple needed to be rebuilt, and they took a free will offering, which means that the temple and the priests didn't tell them that they had to give a certain amount to rebuild the temple. It was of their own free will. They wanted to give an offering to help the temple get rebuilt. Now, we see that Ezra was, I would call by today's standards, a total nerd. He was quite proud of the fact that he had studied all of the laws of Moses, and he knew all the laws, and he knew all of the rules. And so in a big chunk of the book of Ezra, we see where he has determined that the Jewish people had not remained pure. They had intermarried. They had tarnished their perfect blood. And so he came up with a plan to help get rid of all of these bad mixed breed people. Are you following this? It's a story that's only useful because it helps build this case for why Jesus had to come. Why the Jewish people had things so mixed up. It wasn't about all of these rules. And studying the laws of Moses doesn't make you a better person than someone who doesn't know the laws of Moses, because what they then did with these laws of Moses was not right. So in my devotional book, Deep and Wide, I did some writing and reflecting on this whole idea about the whole idea of intermarrying and marrying the people around them. The Jewish men married some women from the countries around them. And now remember, they'd been taken captive. The kingdom of Israel was taken captive by Assyria, and then Babylon then took Assyria, and by default, anything that was left of the kingdom of Israel. Then the Babylonian Empire also captured the kingdom of Judah and hauled the people off into Babylon. And then Persia then captured Babylon. And so then we've got all of these different people that have become their communities around them. And so some of the men married some of the women from these other communities, and the women then married into these other communities. And they weren't so, Ezra wasn't all that concerned with the Jewish women going off and marrying other people, because they didn't really look at women as anything of value. What they were concerned with was where the Jewish seeds were being planted. Remember, they didn't really understand the biology of human anatomy and the biology of birth. They didn't realize that the woman had an egg that had to be fertilized by the male seed, and then that grew and became a baby. They didn't realize that. They considered women just like dirt. You plant a seed in the dirt and it grows a plant. So they thought all of life came from the man's seed or his ejaculate. I mean, he plants that in the woman and it grows just like a seed placed into dirt. So they really weren't concerned about their Jewish women having the seed of the people around them planted in her, because they didn't care about those babies that were born, because they weren't Jewish, or so they thought. But if the Jewish man took a woman as his wife, or planted his seed in a woman who was not Jewish, then they were concerned about that, because that was the Jewish seed that had been placed in her. But then it doesn't really make sense, because Ezra's plan then was just to get rid of them. We just have to get rid of these women that have come in. We just have to get rid of these children that are of mixed race. So I wonder how they dealt with this idea of mixed race, because they didn't know anything about the female providing the egg. They thought all of life was contained in the male ejaculate. So they're speaking in ways that their own words don't align to what they believed at that time. So it's really confusing. So it's kind of like there was this massive divorce amongst their people. Now remember, a man could freely divorce the woman. A woman could not divorce the man. She could ask for a certificate of divorce, but then she would be an adulteress if she slept with anyone else. So there were a lot of things that was wrong with what the people believed and understood, because they studied the law of Moses, and Moses didn't know everything that he thought he knew. And some of the stuff Moses wrote was not of God. Moses just kind of made it up. And Moses' father-in-law helped with a lot of that. So if you're following on in my book, Deep and Wide, we're studying the book of Ezra from July 20th through 24th, and my writings on that begins on page 341. Ezra had studied the law of Moses, and he could prove even that he was a descendant from the house of Levi. So he spent a lot of times trying to prove himself worthy of speaking to these people. And on page 343 and 344, I kind of talk a little bit about what it was like when I first started teaching science. There were things that I taught in science about the solar system and the planets and the moons that by the time I retired, what we knew about the planets and the planets that had rings and the ones with moons, the things that we knew at the time that I retired actually counteracted some of the things that I taught at the beginning. And I was smarter in my older teaching years, because I would start the year, especially when I was still teaching science, and I would tell the kids, I said, once upon a time, when I started teaching science, I taught kids stuff that we thought was true, but now we know that wasn't true. And they kind of look. So I tell them, so what I'm going to teach you in science about things we believe to be true, by the time you get to my age, we might know that this isn't true in the same way. And that's kind of what science is. As we learn things, we find new truths, or we find new facts that inform the truths that we had before. So when I first taught the solar system for 6 weeks every year, when I first started teaching fifth grade in the 1990-1991 years, I taught that Saturn was the only planet that had rings, because that's kind of what we knew at that time. Actually, some of the information from the late 80s came in that countered that, but that wasn't included in our facts or in our textbooks at that time. The Voyager spacecraft eventually brought information to us where we found out that, you know what? It's not just Saturn that has rings. Jupiter has rings, Neptune has rings, and Uranus has rings. So there are actually 4 planets. And then we talked about the number of moons that each planet's had. And, you know, by the time I retired, there were way more moons around some of those planets than we ever even knew. And so I would teach how many moons Saturn or Neptune had. And then by the time I retired teaching, I had taught the kids things that wasn't actually true. So at least I was smart enough in my later teachings to say, I'm going to teach you something that when you get my age, you might find out that we got new information. And so in science, what we know and understand is ever changing. So what the people knew and understood at the time of Ezra's writing about the male seed and planting a baby so it would grow is very different from what we actually know it to be now. You know, kind of our big misunderstandings or our big areas that we're trying to understand now is the whole idea about gender. And is gender 100% just genitalia? Or is there a lot in our mind, in our soul, and our being that we can't draw a picture of and put our finger on to help us understand? And so I always want to seek first to understand. And so when I talk with my transgender friends and they're telling me about their experience, I have to default to believing what they say about themselves because they are the experts on them. If I don't live their reality, then I shouldn't be a person to condemn or tell them that what you're saying about yourself is not true. Just like my understandings of sexual orientation, when I'm talking about me, someone who doesn't have my experiences has no authority to speak about me. So that when we're talking about science now and we're talking about the creation of life and how life exists, we do know even in ancient Jewish and Hebrew texts and other societies around the time, we do know that many civilizations did have more than a binary system of gender. And we do know biologically not everyone is either XX or XY. There are more than two variations genetically of male, female, or the spectrum of male and female. And do we all understand that? No. But should we be making rules for other people and telling them? No, we shouldn't be doing that either. Okay, that really wasn't the point here, and I don't believe I talk about that in my devotions on Ezra. I do see where I did talk about in the United States, in some states, it was illegal for people of different ethnicities to obtain a marriage license. And in fact, there was a Supreme Court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1967, where two individuals actually sued their state because they would not allow them to have a marriage license. And so the Supreme Court case in 1967 ruled that you could not prevent giving a marriage license to two individuals if they were of a different race. And that Supreme Court case stands. That was 1967. I believe it was year 2015 that another case went because some states would not give people of the same gender a marriage license. And so that went before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court also ruled that a state could not deny someone a marriage license simply because of their gender. That was discrimination based on sex. Now, there is a big push right now with some people want the Supreme Court to repeal that ruling. But the way that ruling was ruled, if they repeal that, they will repeal that usually using language that regulating marriage is not a federal responsibility. Therefore, the Supreme Court should not have ruled in those cases, which I don't agree with, but that's what they're wanting to say. So they will say that marriage rules and regulations fall to the state. Now, if they do that, thinking that they're doing away with forcing states to issue marriage license to people of the same gender, they will de facto also take away the state's rules preventing people of different races to obtain a marriage license, because it was the same reasoning in 1967 as the year 2015. Because if they're wanting to repeal it, saying, no, we need to send that back to the state, like they did with abortion, says, no, we're canceling this because that's a state thing. The Fed has no business in that. If they do that with marriage, thinking they're getting rid of same gender marriage rights, they will also be getting away with marriage rights of different races. Now, some states that did go ahead and repeal their laws on the books. Texas is one of those states that never did. There are still laws on the books in Texas where people of different races cannot obtain a marriage license. People of the same gender cannot obtain a marriage license. They are able to do that because the Supreme Court ruled that they could not put those limitations. So if they do repeal the marriage equality based on that's not a federal government's responsibility, and that's a states' rights issue, immediately at the same time in the same state of Texas, people will not be allowed to marry if they are of a different race or ethnicity. So there's a little bit of trivia for you. Now, you know what? But are we talking about that? We are kind of, because Ezra wanted to, Ezra, in his deep study of the laws of Moses, people were not allowed to intermarry with people outside their communities. Now, the main reason for that is that the Jewish people had a long history of intertwining different religions and religious beliefs and practices of things that they did not consider to be actually of God. And so when they brought those other things in, that kind of messed stuff up. So instead of blaming that on them not being true to their faith, they blamed it on it's those other women that we let in, and then those little mongrel half-breed children that are running around, and that's what's right. So they didn't even take responsibility for their own inability to share their faith with other people, but to dilute their faith and turn their backs on God. And so that became a problem. And so Ezra, because he was so smart and studied all the laws of Moses, he determined that we can just get rid of these people. We'll get rid of these people. I want to read a little bit from my devotional on page 348. This was for July 24th. And by the first day of the first month, they finished dealing with all the men who had married foreign women. So Ezra made a plan, and these morons carried it out. And here's my reflection on this. On the surface, this seems like the end of a stupid problem that was compounded by the ignorance of the people. Do we have any of those in our society? They basically made a list of all the men who had married foreign women. The next step was to remove them and their children from the community and send them back to their own people. Irony much? It would appear that we have a massive church-sanctioned divorce pandemic. How could they discard these women and children? Wouldn't the children be half Jewish? We find in the New Testament that mixed marriages were defined as unequally yoked, believers with non-believers. It is stated that if the non-believer was willing to stay married to the believer, then the believer could not divorce them. The contradiction continues. Now, those were some of the New Testament rules. Jesus came to point out to the people that it's not about Moses's rules. I'm here now to fulfill the prophecy. I'm here now. Let me tell you what's more important. And then as soon as Jesus was gone and not walking with them, what did the new apostles do? Let's create some rules. Ezra was never married, and the marriages back then had little to do with love, so feelings really weren't a consideration. As their priest, Ezra was trying to apply logic based on past patterns of behavior. Judah had a long history of letting other religious beliefs and practices sneak into their homes and their communities. Bringing the wives and children of the Jews back to Jerusalem that were not Jewish opened the door for a repeat of what had happened in Judah and Israel. I do not believe Ezra was acting on the instructions of God. Ezra saw a problem and decided he would handle it. He used his human instincts and problem-solving skills and solved a problem. God was surely not pleased. There's a lot of things we have done in our society and in our churches saying, well, here's a problem, we can fix this. And we fix it in our humanness. And I guarantee that in every organization, and in every household, and in every church, in every community, there are examples of people solving problems and doing it completely in their humanness and probably making mistakes. Well, this is my thoughts today on the book of Ezra. Next year, if I'm reading Ezra, I might have some different thoughts, but I think some of my thoughts will carry on. That Ezra is a good example of the people that, in order to be better, you just have to know all the rules. And if you know the rules better than anyone else, then you have authority. That's not necessarily correct. Well, thank you for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.